All right, I guess we can get started. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Extracting Actionable Insights from Narrative Data using AI. Hopefully you all are in the correct room. And if you're not, too bad, the doors are locked. My name is Jay Victoria. I'm a solutions architect at Groundswell, and I've been working with Appian for just about 7 years now. Now, as an Appian practitioner, what we generally want to do is to make our users' jobs and lives easier. We want to add business value, things like that, using the tools we have available to us. That includes things like generative AI. But a lot of times when we think about generative AI, we stop at the generative part, right? We can generate a summary, a report, things like that. But it is a very powerful tool that can actually do a lot of different things to add business value in a lot of different ways. And today, we're going to go over an alternate implementation of generative AI that can add business value across different use cases. And what we're going to do, we're going to go over the business problem we're trying to solve. We're going to go over how we're going to use AI to solve that problem. We're going to go over some of the examples, reports you can build from that, and then we're going to go ahead and have some wrap up and time for questions at the end. So what we're going to do is talk about a common situation that we see in several different industries, and we're going to go over how to solve that and our chosen solution before going into how we're actually going to implement it. And with that, let's talk about a situation we see pretty commonly. So in our Appian applications, we collect a lot of narrative data, so things like progress reports, surveys, complaints, plain text English that's describing something that happened. And in Appian, we have these rich reporting features that we can use to gain insight, to drive business decisions, and to take action from a report. However, historically, it's been difficult to go from this narrative data to these actionable reports. And that's what we're going to try to solve today. Now, what we're talking about is going to be text classification or entity extraction. So what we want to do is we're going to go from a block of text to the important concepts or topics within that text, and then we're going to take that and aggregate it up to build a report. Now, there are 3 main ways we can accomplish this. One is the manual process. Someone goes in and labels every single complaint, in this case, with the various topics. Secondly, we can actually use a classical machine learning method, but that will actually require a large set of well-labeled training data, which we usually don't have. And lastly, and what we're going to talk about today, is we can use LLMs. Now, LLMs, or large language models, are the engines that drive generative AI. They're readily available and easy to connect to. LLMs are powerful tools for both processing natural language and generating natural language. And when configured and architected correctly, can be used to return structured data. However, there can be some issues when we're implementing that. And so let's talk a little bit about what LLMs actually are so that we can understand how we can utilize them. Now, originally, this slide was like 10 minutes of my presentation because I love talking about the implementation of AI and neural networks and all that stuff. But that's not actually necessary for you to know to implement this. So basically, to simplify things, a large language model does a whole bunch of math to return the most probable answer to be perceived as correct based on the data it was trained on. Right? So since it's a probabilistic method, we're not guaranteed both factual correctness and, more importantly, when we're using LLM sort of in a back-end process, formatting. And so, we have this tool that we can use to solve our problem, but we have to, be aware of these issues and be able to work around them when we're implementing our ultimate solution. All right, so we have the problem we're trying to solve, right? We have this narrative data. We want to make reports. We have the tool, LLMs. Let's try to now bring that all together. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go over how we're going to accomplish this. But before we get into that, I do want to make a slight note. So to implement this in your Appian implementation, you're going to need inference from an LLM. In this case, we are using the Appian generative AI skills. That's the simplest way to do it within Appian. And this presentation also assumes that you have at least a little bit of developer experience in Appian. Not going to go super deep into anything here, but just to understand that this is something that is an expectation of the presentation. And now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's talk about what we're actually trying to accomplish, right? So why can't we just use, ChatGPT? Why can't we use just Data Fabric Chat, right? I can go into Data Fabric Chat, be like, how many complaints are about ATMs, right? And it'll return an answer. However, going back to what we're trying to accomplish here, our main goals are making the users' lives easier and adding business value. That we can then break down into some sub-goals that we're trying to accomplish that is going to drive those design decisions moving forward, right? So the Data Fabric Chat is great for those one-off situations, but when you want reports that are going to be used by a wide variety of users, you're going to make sure that you need to I can't read it from there. So we're going to extract these topics from text, what we talked about previously, the entity extraction and text classification, which means we're going to need to build a prompt that returns structured data. We want the extraction process to run automatically, right? So we're running it in the background seamlessly. The users don't even know this is happening, so it needs to be able to gracefully handle unexpected responses and give the LLM the best possible chance to return a valid response. Remember, it's probabilistic. We need to give it the best chance. We also need to then take that structured data, make sure it's being stored in a reportable format, which means setting up a normalized data structure and utilizing, we also want to be able to be utilizing Appian Data Fabric. And lastly, we want to make sure we're ensuring the correctness of our data, right? A lot of times when you get pushback on utilizing AI, it's about, hey, AI makes mistakes all the time. And it does, right? But so do people. And when we have people make mistakes, there's other people there to review and check and make sure it's correct. And we just need to do the same for AI to make sure we include that opportunity for human correction and that we're also going to continue to iterate on the prompt and make sure we're improving our process as we go along. And with that, let's start with extracting our topics from our text. So what we're going to do is we'll start with it's on this side, yes, our input, right? So we have our complaint and sort of our expected response. And the data format you want to return is going to be driven by business decisions. So in this case, we have multiple topics to one complaint. And your format, the way it can be formatted to return, you can have it return in JSON. A markdown table is also good for structured data. Or in this example, we're actually using XML. We're going to go into why we're using XML on the next slide. But just know it can be sort of any structured format that you may need. And when you're building your prompt, this is going to be sort of an iterative process, right? So you'll have your inputs and your outputs, and you'll start typing a prompt, go back, see what it returns, go back, correct it, and this is going to happen over and over again, and this is also going to happen throughout the life cycle of your application and continuing to make sure it's getting better and better, more accurate, things like that. We always want to make sure we're giving the LLM the best chance to return a valid response. And a couple of items for that, just couple of tips. So if you have any additional data that's going into it, into the user prompt input, you can actually specify the format that you want it to return, not return. So if you're having additional data in the user input, right, you will specify the format in the system prompt of what you're giving it, and then the actual data goes into the user prompt. If you are, for things like this, you want to make sure the temperature is set as low as possible. Temperature roughly translates to randomness. We want it to be not as random as possible. And in addition, when you're writing the prompt, it was trained on human language from the internet. And when something's important on the internet, what you do is you put it in all caps, you put a bunch of exclamation points at the end of it. So if something's important, especially when we're talking about like specifying the formatting, things like that, you can put that in all caps, add some exclamation points, and it's more likely to return that particular response. And now that we've got our prompt set up, we want to take this text data, this XML, and translate it into a usable data type that we can use in our process. So when we're running our extraction automatically, we need to be able to gracefully handle errors. So we never want to assume that we're going to get the correct format back. And the thing that is most dangerous is not necessarily like absolute garbage that you're getting back, because you can pretty easily check for absolute garbage and just throw it out. What comes up often, and these are examples that I've actually seen when I've been running these, is it'll start with, here are the topics for the complaint, and then give you the XML. And then obviously this is not valid XML because it doesn't start with a root tag, right? And then also something I've seen, depending on how large your returned value is, you can sometimes hit the token limit on your returned value. And so since it ran out of tokens to return, it just kind of stops. And like, this is not valid XML because we don't have the end tag in here, right? And so we need to make sure that we're not throwing an exception when we run into these issues, right? So in this example, I'm going to go over here because I'm not supposed to get too close to the speaker. We're actually using regex to try to check for all of these tags that we're using. And so we can have some qualifications like I is, check for both uppercase and lowercase, things like that. But we're also making sure that we're checking to see if it's null before we try to extract the data. We're checking to see that it matches what we expect it to match before we try to pull out what's inside those tags, things like that, to make sure that if something went wrong, if it's poorly formatted, we're not throwing an exception within the process, right? We're just sort of, what we're going to do is if something goes wrong, we're just going to sort of record that an error happened and move on. And that way, if this is running sort of in the background while the user's doing other things, it's not going to hold up any other processes. We don't have a process with exception, lying around still technically open, things like that. And so when we have that exception flow, we want to make sure that when we have our process, right, so we might start with like a kind of simple process that we have on the top, so where we extract the topics using the AI skill and then we just write it. We want to make sure that we have an emergency exit flow, right? So when we do have an error, we'll just record that we have an error, go to this other flow where we write it. We can also have additional sub-processes that you might run. So you might give a task to an admin. You might email a group of users, something like that, to let them know, hey, this error happened. You can go back and see what's going on here. And this way, when we're recording our errors and things like that, we'll actually be able to recover more gracefully than if we had to, just go into the process model, see what was broken, fix the broken thing, things like that. And so by pulling those errors sort of into the record, into the data fabric, we can now get into where Appian can kind of shine, which is the human intervention portion of our AI implementation. So whenever this formatting error happens, we can actually have a manual reconciliation process for the 3% or whatever small percent of errors that we're coming into. And since we are recording, all of these errors that are happening, we can then see, like, are there any commonalities among these things that we're having issues with? Is this something that I can go back to the prompt, maybe tweak it a little bit, see what's going on? And that way, we're going to continually iterate on that prompt, on that process, get better and better over time. Yes, and when we're iterating on this process, we want to make sure that, as we said, we're giving the model the best possible chance to return correct data. Something that you might run into is when you're asking for too much. What too much is variable. Everyone's implementation is going to be different. You can sometimes get inconsistent responses. For example, if I was asking for the topics and also how important are the topics from a scale of 1 to 5, and how negatively do people feel on a scale of 1 to 5, things like that, when we're having it return multiple sets of data, you can sometimes get inconsistent responses because it might, the model might prioritize one instruction over another on different calls to the model. Right, so when you have these multiple tasks, it can be best to separate them into separate LLM calls. And so having one call to extract the topics, one call to get like the importance, or another call to get how negative or positively people are feeling about that particular topic. In this case, we might say, hey, on the first LLM call, I'm just going to extract the topics generally, and then on a second call, I might say, okay, I'm going to consolidate the topics that I pulled from the LLM with a list of topics I already have in my database, right? And so we can then, between the two of them, create sort of a more normalized data structure. Which leads us to this. So far, we've been focused on sort of the back-end implementation of what we have set up for our process. But remember, we're trying to make people's lives easier. We're trying to add business value. A lot of the business value is going to come from our reports. And so we have to make sure that when we're storing our data, we're storing it in a normalized way, right? So that if someone has, debit card and debit card replacement, it's not being stored as two separate topics, something like that. And we also want to allow for novel discovery of topics, right? So we want the LLM to be able to return topics that we don't necessarily have defined at the beginning of our process, right? And that is where that value can come from. So if people, let's say, suddenly start complaining about a bad smell in one of our branches, right? And that's not something we were checking for before. We want to have that be discovered so that we can then know that there's a problem and address that problem. And so we'll make sure we'll have our topic table, which will be transactional, and then we'll have a linking table between that topic and our complaint. And we'll be able then to, using Data Fabric, connect it to all the various different records that we've already had set up so that when we're reporting on it, we can aggregate on all these different levels. And in addition, using the Appian Data Fabric, we can also take advantage of inheriting record security, right? So we can expose these reports to anyone within the organization, and they will only be able to see anything in that join table that they can see the complaint for, right? So if something's a legal complaint, maybe only legal people can see it, and we can be rest assured that someone from marketing is not going to be able to see those legal complaints. And so when we implement this, we'll just need to make sure that we're going to go back and continue to iterate on our prompt and our process model and make sure we're storing the data properly. Then, oh, sorry, I forgot I had animations. And so we've stored that data properly in a record, and so once it's there, we can actually act on it as transactional data, right? And so this is, again, human in the middle, human intervention. In this example, the complaint is being processed. It's being processed by a person, right? We want to make sure that everyone's complaint gets resolved in a timely manner. They have the ability to go in and remove topics that aren't actually relevant to this case, maybe add some topics that weren't properly tagged, things like that, and we can record it in the system, which allows us to then build a report on what tags are being added and removed, and allows us to analyze those trends and iterate on the prompt, right? I might want to look into, why does ATM need to be manually added so many times? Why isn't it correctly tagging that there's an ATM issue, right? Or it might be, in here we have removed topic to added topic on the same complaint, right? So a lot of our customer management specialists are removing the tag credit card and adding the tag debit card. In this case, the user is saying, hey, I have a problem with my Visa card. And maybe the LLM is just like, oh, a Visa card is a credit card. I'll just tag it as credit card, right? And so as we learn more about how the model is acting with our data, we can then go back again and iterate on our prompt, make it a little bit better, and we can actually include in sort of building our exception flows if we have topics that we know to be mistagged often. Maybe we do introduce a human when something's tagged with credit card, just like, hey, can you take a double check, make sure this is actually about the credit card, things like that. And so, and that way we can make sure that, as we develop, as we're iterating on our prompts, things like that, that we are then able to, get the best response over time. Yes. And so at this point, we now have a classification process that runs in the background seamlessly. We create data and we store it in a reportable format. And we have the information and the ability to correct and improve when the model makes a mistake. And so once we've got all of that in place, now we can finally start to build our reports. And I am going too fast. It is the end of the day, so I don't think anyone's going to complain about that. Right, so now we're going to go through some example reports that you could build using the data that we had collected on the previous slides in the process that we built. So as always, when you're building these reports, you want to start with the why, right? Why do my users need this information? What are they trying to find out? What is the ultimate problem that they're trying to solve? And that's going to help you figure out what reports you need to make. And again, these are just some examples of what you could build, and we're going to go through a little bit of how they can add value to the business. Let's start with our process HQ. So, Appian's out-of-the-box reporting capabilities, and they're the analysts, the power users, they love this, right? Since we're storing all of this data in the Appian data fabric, we're able to take advantage of all of those reporting features fairly easily. And so your users can create dashboards and reports and things based off of those topics that we collected. They can include that information in process insights, right? Maybe there's a particular type of complaint that always breaks SLA, and so you're able to then surface that information and see what's going on in maybe it's always ATMs because we always have to loop in the ATM company, something like that, and that'll make it a little bit more visible to our business users. And we can also utilize other Appian features like data fabric chat, right? Going back to what we said, having that more information feed back into data fabric chat will make it even more useful to the end users when they're using that tool. So this next report is an overall business-wide report. This is as opposed to Process HQ, it's sort of a pre-built, sort of classic Appian report. This sort of report is something that is going to be valuable to sort of executives and stakeholders, people who have a strategic approach, right, to your business. And so this will allow them to see sort of trends and overall KPIs with regards to their complaints across the entire organization, as well as, see how individual topics are performing within their business, and the ability to drill down and get deeper in on any particular topic that they might need. For example, complaints about ATMs have been up recently. Everything else is going down. Why is this one going up, And so this can be a great jumping off point. They can have a link to see more about those complaints that were tagged for the ATM, in addition to, again, tying it back out to other data that's in the system, right? So, there was a process around resolving this complaint, so we can see, did it breach SLA, things like that. And this will help, maybe drive strategic decisions of where to focus their energy. And so with this broad view, we can also have sort of narrower views, right? So in this case, we have a report for a specific region, the Philadelphia area. And so instead of like the entire spectrum of our organization, I'm just looking at the branches in Philadelphia and the complaints associated with those branches, right? So let's say I'm, head of this region. I want to see like, hey, we have like a lot more complaints about ATMs than the average, right? And then I can even see, we can have more detailed information about that based on, we're tying all this back to data that we have in the system and other places in the system, right? I can look at all the branches that are in my purview and say like, hey, Blaine Street, Carberry Hill, and Mayor Street all have ATM as a top complaint topic within them. And from here, talking about taking action, I can reach out to the branch manager. I can link out to the specific branch record, right? Maybe see what's going on, see what's happening there, and start to, actually resolve these issues. It's one thing to say, hey, we can go and we can find the issues for you. It's another thing to be like, we found the issues for you. Now you can immediately take action on that. You can immediately do something about it. And that's one of the great things about Appian reporting. And with that, we can also have, since we have those topics in the data fabric as a record, going back to what records were originally introduced to me when I started working on Appian 7 years ago, it's a centralized hub around a specific thing, right? So now, we have our reports, they're great, we can, cut the data however we need to, but now we can also take advantage of some of the other features in Appian, right? I can have a record for just the complaints about hours of operation, right? And so I can use things like, I can assign a team to it. I can use features like the record events or comments, right? So we can track, hey, maybe we have a conversation about how are we trying to solve these? Like, is there something going on here, right? Have that collaboration that is so key to the value of Appian, right? And make sure, allow users to actually like take action and make changes. We can use other features like records chat, right? So if I'm using records chat filtering down by we can ask questions about only the complaints that are related to hours of operation. So I can ask more specific questions like, maybe like, hey, are people complaining that we're open too late or that we close too early? Is there a specific day of the week that they're mentioning a lot? Something like that. And so we can still use those features in a more specified way to allow for more pointed responses. And we can, since we're linking all that information together, we can also have really easily do a deeper search, right? I have all of my complaints that have to do with hours of operation, and I can go into each and every one of those and see, what is this person complaining about? Was it a valid complaint, right? Is this something that, was it resolved? I can, pull quotes directly from our customers, and so I'm able to, access that data right at my fingertips, right? So if we're talking about, making someone's life easier, if my boss comes to me and they're like, hey, what's going on with like our hours of operation? Like who's in charge of that? What's going on? I can easily be like, yeah, Super Sam's in charge of it. In the last 2 weeks, we've had this survey. I can go into the records chat. I can start asking some more detailed questions to get some more information. And, I have all of this data that I can use to back up any sort of assertion that I'm making, any point, and it's all there right at my fingertips. And with that, we're going to move into the wrap-up. So some key takeaways that I wanted to just mention. So first, we want to say generative AI is not just about generating text. We can actually use it to extract structured data from unstructured data that we can then use to build reports out of. So constructing the prompt to give you your best chances, best results, it's going to be an iterative process that we have over time, so it's important to make sure we're recording all of the times we have issues so that we can then go back and iterate more. Using Appian and utilizing the users in your system, right, is going to help you pick up where LLMs may not deliver unexpected results. And finally, understanding where that business value is driving, what we're trying to accomplish with regards to the business is going to be what ultimately drives your design decisions. And with that, we have any questions?